Welcome everyone. Welcome to this fourth session of Dualities, the Marriage of Opposites. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Power Center, and I will be your host for today. And as a host, if you have any problems, technical or not, feel free to just message me in the chat or even Eleanor. So today we were joined by Mark Vernon again. Mark is a writer and psychotherapist who presents radio shows and podcasts such as the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with Rupert Sheldrake. With a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy, Mark has authored books such as A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, The Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness, which in part explores the work of Owen Barfield. And also his latest book is the Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey. Today, Mark will discuss the way up and the way down, Dante and the one path from hell to paradise. Just before we begin, I'd just like to very briefly remind everyone of a few guidelines for this call. First of all, we ask participants to mute your microphone just to ensure good quality audio, but at the same time, please do keep your camera on. Throughout the call, please do use the chat, as it's a great way to share your ideas with the group. We do, however, ask to have an open dialogue in the chat and respect each other's ideas and opinion. I know some of you find the chat distracting, so just to turn it off, you can press the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, the session is recorded for archival purposes, and for you all, the recording will be up and running in about 3 days' time, so you should all receive the link when it's ready. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Very nice to join everybody again for a second week, or if it's the first week, welcome. I hope it will be a particularly good week because I love Dante, and I hope that that's going to come across. But also in relation to this overarching theme of dualities and how Dante does dualities in a particular way, although I think it can be seen to resonate with other spiritual adepts as well. Much like last Sunday night, if you were with us, I'll talk for about an hour or so, and then we'll have a break, either in breakout rooms and or go and stretch your legs and find a beverage appropriate to the time of day where you are, and then join up again for the last half hour or so for further questions and comments. And that's often the richest part of the evening, actually. So please do be making a note of comments, thoughts, questions, and sometimes the simplest are the best. There is a side to simplicity which drives right to the heart of things, which is perhaps part of what we are in search of anyway. So yeah, so do bring those questions along for the final half hour. And what we're going to talk about tonight is the Divine Comedy, and how it is a journey that very often uses the theme of dualities in order to reveal the beatific vision to Dante. And I'm going to use a lot of the brilliant artwork illustrations that have emerged over the 700 years since the Divine Comedy was published. And so I'm going to use slides and switch to that now. So I hope that you can see that. James, could you give me, yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so here we have a rough outline of where we're going to travel imaginatively in the next hour or two. The very famous image there of Dante outside the city of Florence with the Duomo's dome, which he wouldn't actually have seen, in fact. I mean, it was built 100 or more years after his death, but nonetheless, the very familiar skyline of Florence, him holding a copy of the Divine Comedy and then pointing to where it all begins with the Inferno on the left there, Mount Purgatory with its terraces behind him, and then up into the high heavens and eventually the Imperium. There's a more schematic version of that journey on the right of that in the white picture, and James has already kindly mentioned my book, but if you enjoy this evening, then I hope you will certainly enjoy my book, which goes into a lot of these things. It's a canto by canto tracking really of what Dante experiences in order that we might follow him, which is how he actually invites us to read the Divine Comedy. He didn't just write for himself, though he most certainly did do that. He wrote for us too, in fact. He's the first Italian to use the word modern, and so writes for the future as much as for his now. So that's a little book plug there. This is a journey which is not just a kind of grand tour of reality like Georgian aristocrats used to do around Europe. It is a psychophysical exploration of reality, and so invites you all the time to be knitting together both life as you know it in the mortal frame, but through the imaginative capacities that we have, be constantly looking towards the immortal side of existence and reality as well. And that in a way is the first duality that the whole of the Divine Comedy is premised upon, that we can explore life not just through its empirical immediacy, its historical events, but through what they bring to us as well, how they resonate with deeper patterns, currents, which actually is the wellspring and source of all that we take to be self-evident in our mortal existence, resting on immortality. And so that's why this schema can be drawn out, but you also immediately realize that there's more going on here than just a bit of geography, that this is at once a journey that Dante went on midway through the course of his life at the age of about 35. He sets it in about the year 1300, and he dies himself in 1321. But it's also something that still speaks to us now, because it's at once a timeless journey. To give a nod to another duality which will become important as the journey goes on, the particular, the more it becomes particular, strangely, the more universal it becomes as well. And of all the many ways you might celebrate Dante's genius, knowing that and really following it through is part of the genius of the Divine Comedy. So this evening, we're going to look at the Divine Comedy in roughly 3 sections, and they will follow roughly the 3 sections of the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. As ever with maps, they are really but a first step towards embracing what is happening to us and around us. And increasingly, as you go through the Divine Comedy, the more Dante is able to play with the supposed boundaries of the 3 domains that he visits. But it's good to have a starting point. And so that's, I think, why he divided the Divine Comedy into these 3 elements. They were familiar to his contemporaries. They're still more or less familiar to us. And so we'll use them this evening. At the top left there, I hope you can see one of William Blake's great imageries. This is just Dante and Virgil setting out towards the gates of hell right at the beginning of the Inferno after they've met. And if there were one duality that's going to guide our thoughts about the Inferno, it's going to be how the way up and the way down reveal themselves to be part and parcel of the same return to the divine. The second image there on the right is another one of Blake's unfinished images. It comes right at the beginning of the Purgatorio, where Virgil is wiping the dirt of Inferno from Dante's brow with one of the living reeds at the foot of Mount Purgatory. And if there were one duality that shapes that part of the journey, it's the realization that tragedy and comedy actually go together. The terrible things that undoubtedly happen to people, the suffering that people experience, gradually comes to be seen as part of the delight of life, the way to experiencing the light, in fact, the older sense of comedy, the commedia, that all things tend towards the good. And, you know, this shouldn't be said lightly, because tragedy is tragedy, but that is something that becomes clearer through the suffering of Mount Purgatory, in fact. And so we'll explore that in the second part of our journey this evening. And then in the third part, I hope at the bottom there you can see one of Botticelli's wonderful images. It shows now Beatrice and Dante beginning their takeoff into the Paradiso through the seven heavens of the planetary spheres and then into the Empyrean itself. And there I think we will see, I'm going to try and convey how in fact dualities in Dante's vision tend towards trinities that then reveal a dynamic, harmonious, dancing, spinning is one of the last words that Dante uses, unity. And I hope that it will be a celebration really this evening of how these elements link together through our thoughts about the Divine Comedy, and not least using some of these wonderful images. In some ways, for those of you who were here last week, where I talked about Plato, and we thought about Plato's use of dualities to form dialectic dynamics that help us to enter more intimately into reality, as well as transcend the immediacy of our experience. Dante has a very similar conception in a way, but with, in particular, monotheism fully developed now in the 12th, 13th century. You know, it's 1700 years or more after Plato's time. And so monotheism has become the perception, at least of the Christian world, very clearly. And Trinitarian ideas, in a way, is how Christianity does monotheism. Dante is really helpful in trying to understand that. And if there were a basic pattern to hold in mind, it's how in this dynamic vision of reality, 2 leads to 3 that leads to 1. If that sounds a bit mystical and numerological right now, well, hold it in mind, and I hope that it will make a lot more felt sense as well as intellectual sense by the end of this evening. So that's our 3 broad boundaries, which we're going to treat as porous as well through the course of the evening. So let's begin more or less at the beginning. Here is another one of Blake's images. You'll know that Dante wakes up mid through the course of our life. In fact, he says not just his life, our life. He knows that there's something timeless about this journey himself. And Blake captures a lot of the dynamics, the dualities that Dante is going to have to contend with. For example, you'll notice that although Dante talks about it being a dark wood, Blake shows that this is a dark wood with the sun shining, and Dante sees the sunrise at the beginning of his journey and tries to make a shortcut towards the rising sun, thinking in a way, oh well, it's just a kind of bad morning, but much like any other day, perhaps when the sun rises, the warmth returns to the day, it'll be like any other day and I'll be able to get on with life. But this is a day like no other now. Dante is going to have to undergo a huge self-transformation, requiring him to visit not just parts of his life, but one way or another, the whole of life, if he's to fully know what the sunrise stands for. And he goes up towards the sun to be met by these 3 beasts, symbolically, I think, displaying for him how his seeming virtues have actually degenerated, become vices midway in the course of his life. And they provide the first sense that the way down is the necessary course to really know the way up. He must go through these vices to understand the virtues that can take him towards the sun, towards the divine life with its light and warmth. And Virgil appears. This is about undergoing a series of transformations Dante himself used the medieval hermeneutic to interpret life, which says that although literally things happen to us and literally things are described in texts, which can have a moral or allegorical sense, life carries meaning, it's not just sheer events. To really know the divine reality through and behind life, we must embrace the tropological stage, the turning point that not just expands our perceptions as if that's a linear progress, but invites us to go through a kind of breakdown in order that we can know the breakthrough. And on the other side of the trouble, of the tropos, tropics are the turning points in the heavens of the tropological experience, become completely established in the divine life that is the source of our life. And so Virgil appears as the first of Dante's guides to help him through these thresholds. And Dante, I think, writes for us as a guide as well. This is not an easy journey that he's inviting us to track as he embarks upon it. And I think for a number of reasons, make a first stab at why the way down and the way up are one and the same. One is that God doesn't want human puppets. God wants creatures to know of the creation, and certainly we humans, who knows, maybe other creatures as well, but certainly we humans, with a full self-consciousness. We don't just act by instinct. We don't just act out of desire and fear, although we certainly do that. We human beings, at least, can act with our intellect fully engaged, with our sense and taste for the infinite, the good, the beautiful, and the true, enlivened. But that means that we can't just get led blindly, but that our eyes must open in order to appreciate the divine life from whence we came and where we're returning to, fully, with all of our faculties alert. And in a way, this means that we have to take risks, we have to make mistakes, we, I think, have to embrace suffering. As Plato told us last week, the light becomes clearer to us when we've seen how it flickers in the shadows. And so that's, I think, a first stab at why the Inferno comes before the Purgatorio and then the Paradiso. Another way of putting this is not just that God doesn't want us as robots, but wants us to be fully conscious participants in the divine life. It's to say that this is a universal religion in Dante's perception. I don't think Dante thought that some people were destined for an eternal hell at all, as becomes clear with paradisal eyes, but that in order to understand how evil, what's bad and suffering is taken absolutely seriously, and not just, as it were, wiped to one side, we must embark on the journey down before the journey up becomes clearer and clearer to us. And as St. Paul puts it, we realize that God always was already all in all. There's something about the seriousness of the darkness that we have to encounter in order to understand the fullness of the divine vision, as it's expressed in the Christian tradition here, but as it's expressed in other universal spiritual traditions as well. To cut to the chase, everything must always be in God, otherwise it would just fall out of existence altogether. But that then leaves the great question of how that which seems dark and evil can be in God. And the way down leading to the way up is Dante's experiential way of trying to answer that question. Just to put it in one other way, if our destiny lies with the divine, as I'm sure it does, how can it be that we still are free participants in this divine life? If in a way there are ultimately no wrong turnings, life is a labyrinth, not a maze, you might say, how can it still be that we are free participants as well as conscious participants and understanding participants, having seen all, including the darkness as well as the light? And Dante's Divine Comedy is a way of trying to answer that question as well. I hope that in the context of this evening, you can see some of the dualities that he's working here with, you know, our freedom, but our destiny, our consciousness, but our dependence upon the divine. These things can go together, which I hope we'll learn something about. Here's an old woodcut that begins their journey into hell proper. You can see, I hope, there to the right, the gates of hell with the words per me written above it, through me, by me. And it's particularly interesting, this image of it, because on the left there you see Virgil and Dante talking, and Dante getting nervous about this journey. He tries various excuses on Virgil, saying, oh, he's not up to it, and so on. And Virgil says, no, no, you're human, you are up to it. Don't try to pass modesty off on me. We are called to know the divine. You know, if there's anything in the heart of the Christian tradition, at least, it's that the human and the divine meet. And Virgil wants Dante to understand something of that. But what's also interesting about this image is right in the middle there, Virgil also tells Dante why he's there, because Beatrice, Dante's great beloved, who awoke him to the more in life through the early experience of love, Beatrice came to Virgil and said to Virgil, you must go and guide Dante, he's losing his way. And moreover, Beatrice was sent by St. Lucia, the angel of the saint of light, who was herself sent by the Virgin Mary, no less. And by the end of this evening, we'll see how significant that is. And so Dante's told all this right at the beginning. You know, and Virgil even says how beautiful and amazing it was to see Beatrice. And yet Dante mustn't just know that this has happened, he must know about what all that means. And that's why just being told by Virgil at the start isn't enough to, as it were, short circuit the journey. He is going to understand what this means in the fullness of his being, because the fullness of his being has resonated with all being. And that's another key thing really about the Divine Comedy, and that speaks so much to our life. You know, we can be told that X is the case, our destiny lies with the divine, but unless we fully know what that means, we will only partially participate in that promise. And so, even as on one side of this image, Dante sees the light, on the other side, he sees the gates to the place where there is darkness. And that is why he embarks on the journey through the Inferno. Now, there's a huge amount goes on, as I'm sure you know, through the circles of hell. And I just want to touch on 2 or 3 points to just expand on this way up, way down idea a little bit more. Here's one of Botticelli's wonderful cartoons showing Virgil and Dante making their way. They've entered the city of Dis at this point, and that's why there's the battlements behind them. And you can see some devils there who had taunted and frightened Dante, at least, now standing to one side. An angel of God appeared and told them to do what they had to do, which they knew they had to do anyway, which was to follow the will of God. And with that voice, they stand to one side. And Dante and Virgil enter into the city of Dis. But there's a detail here that is hugely significant. And details, as well as the broad story, are such a crucial part of the Divine Comedy, which Dante's telling us is, look, the details in your life matter too. Don't miss what the detail might be telling you. And at this point, the detail is that Dante and Virgil turn to the right rather than walking to the left. Up to this point, they had circled through hell, always following a left-handed track. And they'll do so most of the time, in fact, turning to the left, turning to the left. But at this point, they turn to the right. And they do so because they're in the domain of the heretics. And this is so interesting because heresy, in a funny sort of way, is part of the journey. And I think the point is being made that if we're to make this experience our own, fully to become aware of what God promises, we need to take the risks of making mistakes, but not going so far from the path that we get completely lost, as these tombs that Dante sees in the first part of Within the Walls of Dis suggest can happen. There's Epicureans here who felt that there was no individuality in the afterlife and that the gods had nothing to do with them. And they see some Epicurean souls, but they also encounter some other souls that Dante knew. You see him talking there to one of his compatriots. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, they come to the tombstone of a pope. You can see the word Papa there. And it's the first of the papal encounters. Popes don't do very well in the Divine Comedy, following their own path too much, you might say, even as they're the head of the church. So there's flexibility in this journey. It's not just about following, you might say, a moral code or becoming spiritual robots. Turning to the right as well as the left is a useful experiment to take when you sense the mood is right. And in this psycho-spiritual journey, the mood of the heretics takes over Dante and Virgil at this point for the good, in fact. That's part of the way. Now, much further down in the place called Malebolgia, Dante and Virgil now in the 7th circle of hell, they encounter here a figure who is holding his head as if it is a lantern. You know, the name of this figure has just gone from my mind, but someone might well know it and they can put it in the chat for us. I wanted to put this figure in particularly, this moment of encounter in particularly, because partly this is the moment where Dante himself uses the word contrapasso, and contrapasso is the old Italian used to describe how the punishments, so-called, of the Inferno are somehow related to the life that the individuals had led. But the point about this Bolgia in Malebolgia is that you mustn't just stick to the literalism. It's not actually the punishment fitting the crime that Dante and Virgil have been experiencing, but rather people who have led their life by their own lights and have got cut off from the divine light. And you see that here with this figure who's literally got his eyes only, as if they are the light that he must see life by. We would nowadays call it literalism, call it fundamentalism, call it a kind of narrowing of the spiritual capacity. So eventually you can see nothing but what you think to be the case. So this is a really important part of, again, understanding how the way down and the way up are one and the same, because it's often the case that those who feel surest about the way, who are actually the most trapped, they only know the way down, not the way up, in fact. And the key to that is that they've cut off from divine reality, divine light, in following their own light too closely. Dante sees that in this Bolgia of Malebolgia. And then in a further circle down, Dante fully faces another part of this way down and way up dialectic, because he himself acts more and more infernally the further down in hell he goes, you know, as he must, because this is not just embarking on a journey as a kind of spectator. You can only enter these lower circles of hell by being in touch with how the part of you is already in that lower circle of hell. Here he is pulling the hair of a chap called Bocca degli Abati. He was an enemy of Dante's from the Florentine Civil War that so ruined Dante's mortal life. And in this moment, Dante is torturing the figure who was already tortured. He himself is falling so far from the divine light and the divine light, the divine love too in this moment. The figures here are frozen in the lake of hell, which is on the floor of the Inferno. You know, they're reaching the point here where vitality is almost slipping to zero. And so one of the great reveals in the Inferno is that at the heart of hell is not a fiery furnace, quite the opposite. A fiery furnace would be far too lively for the state that these individuals find themselves in. No, it's a frozen, desolate landscape, almost, we might say now, absolute zero. They're so close to falling out of being that they almost have no being, but they still have a vestige of being, of divine life. Everything is in God, but Dante can only experience that when he knows the hate and anger and rage that is in him. And so that's part of what takes him to these lower circles of hell. He must be exposed to all that he is in order to understand how God is in all things. And then finally, on the floor of hell, they come to the angel of light who fell the furthest, to Lucifer. But this is one of the wonderful moments in the journey, because what you can see here in Botticelli's image is that the way up is not to turn around and to say, okay, Dante, you've seen enough now, we can now look at the light. They crawl right onto the body of Lucifer and clamber down his side through the ice. And it's at the absolute nadir that the turning point occurs. And this is one of the great insights that within Christianity would be put as how the judgment is also the salvation. And it's the judgment that doesn't condemn. It's the kind of judgment that sees so as to find the turning point and release. You might say it's the judgment that brings light even into the darkest place. And that's what Dante, with the help of Virgil, is just about able to do. He doesn't himself quite teeter out of existence and touch the dark as he touches the darkest part of himself, and so the darkest part of the cosmos too. No, they bring the divine light even into this darkest place, and that is precisely the route to begin the ascent. It's the moment where they realize fully that the path down is the path up, in fact. And so, as you can see at the bottom of this Botticelli image here, they find that they're actually climbing up as they thought they were climbing down on Lucifer's body, and they find their way out of the Inferno and come to Mount Purgatory. So we've looked a little bit at the way up and the way down now. If you remember the image, I don't know, in your imagination, maybe it already feels like quite a long time ago when Virgil and Dante were talking in the woods. They've embarked all the way down through the Inferno. And now we're going to come to the second part. There is Virgil wiping the brow of Dante. And we're going to look a bit more about how tragedy and comedy are linked through contemplating their journey up Mount Purgatory. You know, it's a particularly important question, you might say, that they're going to address now, which is how suffering can be part of a cosmos that is rooted in goodness. But they're going to answer it, Dante's going to answer it for us, not by some kind of logical plate spinning. They're going to answer it experientially. And I think that's the key to this great conundrum of theodicy. It's only actually by entering more and more and more into life experientially that you understand how this seeming duality goes together, that tragedy and comedy can be told as part of the same tale. The goodness can embrace the suffering. It becomes clearer by embracing life itself, not just trying to work it out abstractly. We must go on this journey, as I've, as we said right at the top there. Just get to the next slide. Yeah. So a first part of this understanding comes when they've circled around the lower parts of Mount Purgatory a bit, and encountered lots of souls who have fairly recently died, but don't quite know what they're doing. And a turning point is reached when they come into a rather beautiful valley, captured in Dore's image here, and they see lots of rulers sitting around on the lovely grass. But what's so fascinating to Dante is that they don't seem to see the beauty around them. And it's explained to Dante that these are rulers who are still preoccupied with their mortal lives. They're still contemplating the past, or at the same time wondering about their future reputations. And in this moment, a theme that had been emerging becomes clear, I think, that this embrace of life requires us to be able to come into the present moment. You might say that one of the things which trapped people in the Inferno wasn't the kind of divine judgment that trapped them there forever, although actually many of the souls they encounter thought that was the case. No, what they lack is the judgment of the present moment, where they can take responsibility for their past, not be overly preoccupied with the future, in order to embark upon the change themselves. You might say, take responsibility for what happened to them in their lives, which of course is easier said than done. And in this valley, a little bit up Mount Purgatory, Dante sees these great rulers whose preoccupation with the past is sort of self-evident because they were public figures, gradually waking up to the fact that they're in a new reality now, but they must be able to embrace the present moment in order to understand that new reality, which the key feature of is change, is transformation. You know, on Mount Purgatory, people still suffer, but they suffer with hope. And that is what coming into the present moment increasingly enables us, not just them, to do. So this means that Dante and Virgil, having understood that, are able to move from the lower reaches of Mount Purgatory, here shown in this rather wonderful modern image, and go through the gate, the sort of threshold there, which you can see right in the middle of the image, and so climb up the terraces of Mount Purgatory to the fire, which you can see just right at the top there. That's what happens next. There are 7 terraces in all, and I'm going to leap straight up to about the midpoint of Mount Purgatory, which is also the first night that they spend on the mountain, and talk about a dream that Dante has, because I think it's another key moment, another key understanding of the power of the present moment, because in this dream, and then what Virgil tells him actually happened, 2 sides of Dante come together, and because he's able to hold them together now, he can continue the ascent. So what you have here are 2 images. On the left is an image that carries a lot of what Dante actually dreamt. He dreamt mythologically of the moment that Jupiter became an eagle and kidnapped the beautiful youth Ganymede in order to have Ganymede alongside him on Mount Olympus. So this is an image of rape. It's an image of lust, of possessiveness. And when Dante awakens from the dream, he's absolutely distraught, because he realizes that although he's dreamt mythologically, the myth has spoken to him because it speaks of his psyche, of a side of himself that similarly is gripped by lust, by rape, by possessiveness. It's a horrible moment for Dante. It's a moment of real suffering. And yet, on the right-hand side of the image here, of the screen here, I hope you can see Blake's representation of what Virgil tells Dante actually happened while he slept, which is that St. Lucy appears and carried him up the mountain to the threshold, the gate which you saw in the previous image there. It's an image of self-giving love, of love that can carry you because it draws you more towards that which is beautiful, good, and true, as the angel, the saint of light, can do. So Virgil tells Dante, no, love in its wonderful sense was actually lifting you further up the mountain. And so Dante has to grapple with these two sides of his experience, one which feels more external to him in this moment, and almost like it can't combat the internal image of lust that he's experienced. And yet Virgil tells him, well, no, actually, the light, the love, the goodness, the beautiful Lucy has carried you up the mountain. That's what's actually happened. Can you both contain and hold what you dreamt and still give thanks for where you find yourself now at the threshold? And you can only, I think, do that in the present moment. It's a wonderful indicator to us as to how beginning to bring all that we are together in the dualities of our experience, and of course everything that falls in between the extremes, that is a crucial part of being able to embrace and understand divine God being all in all. So that's on the first night of Mount Purgatory, and they spend 3 nights on Mount Purgatory in all. And I've come now to right to the top terrace, because in this moment, another key transformation for Dante fully emerges. He, if you like, is now understood that there's an eternal now, which is the moment of change, unlike the past and the future, which, you know, we can't change in because they are past or the future. He's understood that by embracing all that he is, lust as well as love, he can carry on climbing up the mountain. And now, on the 7th terrace, he is invited by Virgil, who you can see there, to step into the fire of love, which will purge him, not in the sense of taking away the bad sides of him, but purge him in the sense of being able to see more clearly all the sides of him, and so being more capable of seeing all the sides of reality. It's a cleansing of the doors of perception, to use Blake's phrase, that he sees in this moment. But he's terrified. He says to Virgil, these are flames. It's all very well for you, Virgil, he says. You're in a spiritual body. I'm still in my mortal body here, and who knows what will happen if I step into the flames. Fear overtakes him once more. And yet Virgil is saying to him, no, it's by leaning into your suffering now that you'll be able to sense how it's the path to more. And I think this is a really crucial insight for us as well, that I mean, you see this in psychotherapy, actually, that people will come to you really wanting suffering to be taken away. And why wouldn't they? Because it is suffering. They're stuck in an inferno of pain of one sort or another. And yet there comes a moment where, because you feel you're not alone with the suffering anymore, because you've become capable of seeing that that which happened in the past, that which you fear happening in the future, doesn't actually determine the present, the now, that you become able to lean more and more into the suffering and to understand how it is the path towards the transformation and the transcendence of the suffering. You know, put it like this: the magnitude of what we experience in the darkness is actually an indicator to us of the magnitude of the divine light that can reach right across and through the darkness. And so this is the experiential answer to the problem of suffering that I think Dante particularly experiences on the seventh terrace when he steps into the flames that are going to cleanse his perception completely. The terrible experience of stepping into the flames, he says, I would rather have stepped into boiling glass to find some coolness than be in these flames. And yet he knows that the very extremeness of that experience is but a foretaste of the fullness of the divine experience that's going to become open to him on the other side. It's one of these mysteries that if you were just told, you might think was even cruel or masochistic. But when you've experienced something of how comedy, delight, the goodness overcomes tragedy, not because it repels it or rejects it, but precisely because it embraces it, then you understand something of what Dante is describing. And of course, at the other end of the Renaissance, Shakespeare understood this fully, which is why he so carefully follows the track of tragedy often to reveal the comedic ending in various ways at the end of his plays. Now, I wanted just to show you a couple more images of this, which actually come from the Paradise, partly to show that certainly by this stage of the Divine Comedy, the boundaries between infernal, purgatorial and paradiso places are starting to blur and merge, because Dante's getting wider and wider perception. He's now seeing more and more, you might say, from the eternal point of view, not just from the mortal point of view. But particularly because one of the people they encounter low on in the heavens, low down in the heavens, in the sphere of the moon, is the figure of Piccarda, who you can see here in one of the wonderful early illustrations to the Divine Comedy. And what Piccarda tells Dante is that although her life as a nun, which you can see there, was horribly, unjustly interrupted, because basically her brother came, pulled her out of the Poor Clare's convent where she was living and married her off to try and secure a political deal. Piccarda was distraught about that at the time, but she tells Dante that I now thank God for it, because I realize now that even the worst thing that I feared happening, and not just something happening randomly, but deliberately, willfully, by my brother unjustly taking me out of the convent, that awoke me to the fact that even the worst thing happening to me couldn't take the divine reality from me. And I know that now here in the heavens. You know, it's not masochistic. Piccarda's not saying I would want it to happen and would will it to happen. What it is the precipitating moment, the tropological moment where Piccarda realized that there was even more that she could see in this darkest moment. And that is what enabled her, when she died, to step into the heavens, because that perception had become conscious to her in life. And then just to give a kind of counter example as well, it's not actually, funny enough, just suffering that can precipitate eternal awareness, because another figure that they meet in the sphere of Venus, in fact, is a woman called Cunitza. And Dante's quite surprised to see her, because she was well known to have lived a life of pleasure in her mortal existence. And in this wonderful image by Giovanni di Paolo, you'll see there Cunitza in the sphere of Venus, and these 4 towns beneath her, because in her mortal life she was married 4 times to 4 different men, and was also known to have had various lovers. She was a convinced pursuer of the delights of mortal love, and yet the pursuit of that pleasure contained within it a seed of eternal delight, eternal love. And so within the ups and downs of her married life, of her pursuit of other paramours as well, there was actually a divine light drawing her for all the mess and the complications of that. And so that's what she's able to tell Dante. You might say it's not just the suffering that carries kernels of the way for us, it's also pleasure that carries kernels of the way. But we must try to be pursuing the kernel, as it were, and not just giving in to the pleasure. So that's Kunitsa, who tells Dante that it kind of cuts both ways, this tragic comedy duality, which they experience in the early parts of the heavens. Now, we've actually become towards the Paradiso already, but just to sort of check in where we've got to on the journey. We've seen something of the way up and the way down being the same. We've seen something of the tragedy and the comedy of life being one and the same. And now in the Paradiso, which Dante tells us is the hardest, most difficult part of his journey, we're going to see how these dualities actually lead to what in the Christian tradition is celebrated as the Trinitarian vision of life, but a Trinity that speaks to us of how the unity of all things is dynamic. It's not just a kind of static singularity when we celebrate how all things are one, how God is one. It's a dynamic, harmonic diversity that sings of the divine unity. And Dante's going to understand more and more of that as he goes through the paradise, guided now by Beatrice, who he's met at the top of Mount Purgatory. And so hence Botticelli's image there showing us Beatrice now as Dante's guide as they enter the planetary spheres. What Beatrice is going to do for Dante in a way is gradually titrate into his soul, into his eyes, into his life and being, more and more of the divine light. Here, I hope you can see in Botticelli's image, Botticelli is so good at capturing a myriad moments where Beatrice attends to her charge and just enables him to see a little bit more of what's going on around and around. And so here, shown climbing the ladder into a higher heaven, which you can see in the second image of Beatrice and Dante, the slightly blurrier one, even as angels dance around them. Dante is being guided to become capable of more and more and more by Beatrice. But what's also interesting about the Paradiso is that he can make mistakes as well. But he knows now fully that mistakes are actually thresholds into the appreciation of more. He goes blind on one occasion. He is deaf to the music of the heavens on another. I put this image here of John Flaxman up because this is the moment actually where Dante and Beatrice first meet. And you might think it would be a joyful, romantic encounter, a reunion of young love, which was the love that was stirred in Dante when he was young on the streets of Florence. But actually, Beatrice chastises Dante quite horribly, it seems, actually. At one point, the angels who are around them plead with Beatrice to have some mercy on Dante. And Beatrice says, no, there's something absolutely crucial in this moment, even though now he's on the verge of paradise that he misunderstands. And it's shown in another Blake image here. There's Beatrice in the great carriage that she appears before Dante on. All sorts of symbolism going on in this image, of course. But I think that this is Dante experiencing the tropological, not just experiencing as it's suffering, experiencing it as leaning into it for sure, but now knowing that this is part of his divinization. This is a crucial way in which he will disidentify with his younger self, the self that fell in love with Beatrice, in order to know his true identity, which will be shown to be one with the divine life. It's ultimately a non-dual vision that the Divine Comedy leads us to. But much like in other traditions where almost the last step that the sage or the adept makes is one of terrible dislocation. I mean, I think the Sufis are particularly good at this. If you ever read the stories of the great Sufis, in myth as well as in life, I mean, you'll know that Rumi was already an accomplished Sufi mystic when Shams, his guide, just suddenly disappeared for no reason. And I think that that was a parallel moment to Dante's experience of encountering Beatrice, where Beatrice doesn't just sort of love and hug him and say, welcome home, it's all going to be lovely now. She says, no, no, no. Actually, in a way, this is where your journey's beginning in terms of realizing your divinization. And it's the jolt of now knowing Beatrice as a guide, not the object of his love, that this moment tries to capture, much as Rumi perhaps had to let go of Shams in order to fully know for himself what Shams had been trying to show him all along. And what happens is that gradually the number 3 starts to emerge with this divinization. And here's one moment captured in an early manuscript where this occurs. It shows here Virgil and Dante having been joined by another figure called Statius. And Statius is actually the first figure on Mount Purgatory that they encounter who has already been redeemed and is ready to enter paradise. So Statius is kind of this in-between stage of being paradisally ready, but still leaving purgatory. But I wanted to reflect on this moment because it shows how threeness starts to emerge as our perception grows. Because what happens in this moment is that, well, first of all, Dante is very surprised to see Statius having been redeemed, because he knew Statius from the history of Statius being a poet who was a pagan as well. And yet here he is redeemed. And so it challenges Dante to expand the rather narrower vision of Christianity that assumed that if you didn't know Christ, you couldn't know God. Here is a figure who does know God, and yet, at least according to what Dante understood, didn't know of the Christian vision. But moreover, Statius then turns to Virgil, as he's doing here, and says, but do you know what? I know of the fullness of divine life because of what you, Virgil, had shown me in your poetry. And Virgil is surprised at this because Virgil says, but look, I assumed that whilst it's been my divine calling to guide Dante, I'm about to return to limbo, where I have been up to this point. And so what this moment, I think, suggests is that Virgil has been on a journey, even as he's been guiding Dante, as much as Dante being on the journey as well. But what's lovely about these 3 figures, I hope you can stay with me on this, it's part of the subtlety of the Divine Comedy, which is why it's one of these texts that just keeps giving more and more and more as you study it. What we've got here, in a way, is a figure, Virgil, who lived before Christianity and yet awoke Christianity in Statius, who lived in the 1st century AD, even as the disciples were starting to spread the word. He tells Dante that he heard of them and admired them, and so it awoke a light in him. And yet Statius is always also able to tell Dante something about redemption and about how they're on their way to paradise, even as they climb up Mount Purgatory. And so the 2, Virgil and Dante, becomes 3, Virgil, Statius, and Dante, which gives us a first indicator of how actually paradisal perception is about 2 breaking into 3, enacted in this encounter. And in fact, you know, the last parts of Mount Purgatory are tracked with these 3 figures traveling together. Now, this threeness appears in other ways in the Paradiso proper. Here you have an image of the heaven of the sun. You've got John Flaxman's image there of the brightness of the heavenly sun, and then a bit more detail in an earlier illustration, which shows Dante and Beatrice there in the middle, surrounded by 12 lights, 12 figures who spoke in their mortal lives with great clarity about divine things, and so were felt to shine with the clarity of the light of the sun. But what Dante realizes is that these figures disagreed about the light that they carried and that they seemed to speak so brightly about. And in fact, one of the figures is Thomas Aquinas, and another figure is a chap called I've forgotten his name, someone of Brabant, Segar of Brabant. And the interesting thing about him is that he was an Averroist, an advocate of Muslim philosophy. And Thomas Aquinas had condemned Segar to as a heretic in life, you know, in other words, to seemingly fixed eternal torment. But here in the sphere of the sun, they're able to see that their two positions that seem so diametrically opposed, in truth, can be triangulated, because they both, in their different way, in their full passion, if you like, which was at loggerheads on earth, conveyed the one light which lay behind both of their separate lights, as they saw it at least on earth. So it's another really crucial moment that when you follow, you might say, the energy of what someone's saying, you can actually detect the divine light behind it. And in that divine light, realize that even great disagreements on earth can be unified in the heavens, within God. You know, we human beings can get so passionate about our convictions that we tear into others who have different convictions. And yet Dante's learnt here in this moment that awakening the divine part of himself is not actually, as it were, so much to worry about the content of what people say, but to listen in that little bit more carefully to the spirit with which they say it. And in that triangulation of conflict will be detected the spirit of the divine light. It's another way in which duality becomes a trinity and shows something of the one divine light. The same thing happens in a different register when they enter the heaven of Jupiter. In Dore's image here on the left-hand side, the great dramatic thing that happens in the heaven of Jupiter is the appearance of the eagle of Jupiter. But you can see that the eagle of Jupiter is made up of a myriad souls, which Giovanni de Paolo paints a bit more explicitly in the image of on the right-hand side. And what Dante realizes here is how the particularity of an individual life, when it's lived fully with the light, with the passion, with the desire for beauty and truth that we can have, that we can get in contact with, it doesn't lead to the merger of the souls into a sort of homogeneous oneness. He sees, as Giovanni shows here in the figure of the eagle, the individuality of all the souls shown in their faces. And yet, as the Sufis says, the more you see an individual's face, the more you see the divine face shining and speaking through to you. And Dante particularly encounters three figures in the eyebrow of the eagle, which again really shocks him, because they're either deathbed conversion Christians or figures who lived actually hundreds of years before Christianity, and yet in their individual life knew enough of the divine life to find their way to the heavenly life when they died. This is the moment where Dante realizes most fully how particularity and universality go together, which, you know, again is a key insight in the Christian tradition, expressed in how the one person, the one human being of Jesus could be at the one and the same time, the universal presence of the divine Logos. You can state it, but can you see it? Dante is challenging us in this moment. Now, they're getting into the higher heavens now. I'm coming towards the end of what I have to say before we break for discussion and so on. But I wanted to show you this image. On the left, we have Dante and Beatrice kneeling before really Dante's first direct perception of the divine. He sees a point of infinitely small but infinitely bright light, and he knows as he glimpses it that it's from this source that all life and light comes and springs. He describes it as the center that's also the circumference of all things, but whilst it's the circumference of all things, it's also the center. It's a step up, if you like, from the perception of how the particular and the universal go together. It's another way of putting it is that he now knows that reality, rather than being, you might say, spatial, you know, I'm here, you're there, he knows it relationally, that we can be in the same place even when we're in different places. And it's at this moment particularly that the full vision of the angels appears to him, which is why I've put Dore's image on the right-hand side. He realizes that angels are relational creatures and that they transmit the divine life in relational ways at various levels of reality. I mean, some, like the seraphim and the cherubim, are closest to God, and so relate the closeness of the divine life to us. Others, like the powers and the principalities, are mediating the divine life to the collective levels of reality, you might say. They're the angels of life and light at national level, at country level, at planetary level. And then some of the angels, like what we call the angels, the guardian angels, the archangels, are the angels that mediate the relationality of God to us most directly. You know, if you ever see an angel, chances are it's going to be one of these kind of angels that is connecting the relational light of life, of God's light, to you directly. You know, this is an organic, dynamic, living perception of reality that Dante has now. You can say it in abstract ways in one way, like the circumference and the center being one and the same, but it's lived experience too. And when you realize that the connections between us are actually relational connections rather than, say, spatial connections or temporal connections, then you understand how the separation of life and death, of good and bad, of darkness and light, all these dualities actually connects. And a final thought on this, just drawing towards a close, which I wanted to share with you, because Dante has the chance at one point to speak to Damien. Here you see the story of Damien's life, how he became a hermit in particular. And there's a crucial moment, I think, where Peter Damien explains to Dante how he was able to embrace the divine light and be embraced by the divine light. And he says, a ray of God's light focuses on me and penetrates the light enwombing me, whose force, once joined to that of my own sight, lifts me above myself until I see the primal source from which such might is milked. So what Peter Damien is explaining is how his sight, he realizes, was the divine sight, and the light that he felt focusing on from him was the divine light that was already enwombing him. And so his I amness can be connected to the divine I amness, because his I amness always already sprang from the divine I amness. I'll just read this through again. A ray of God's light focuses on me and penetrates the light enwombing me, whose force, once joined to that of my own sight, lifts me above myself. He identifies with the divine source until I see the primal source, which such might is milked. And as Dante reaches the end of the Divine Comedy in the Paradiso, it's particularly the figure of the Virgin who becomes key. This is actually Blake's last image that he did of the Divine Comedy. You may know that he was working on this even as he died, even as he was entering paradisal realms. And it shows the Virgin and on the right, I put this icon of the Virgin as the cosmic Mary, because what it shows is that she's the type for this kind of mystical perception, because she was able to say yes to all when she said yes to Gabriel. And you remember that Gabriel tells her a sword will pierce your own heart as well. She was able to say yes to infernal experience, purgatorial experience, as well as paradisal experience. And her yes to it all was what enabled the all, the divine Logos, to be in her womb, leading to the divine life enwombing her. This dynamic becomes the driving force in the last part of the paradisal journey. And it's a moment where two-ness becomes three-ness again, because, well, let me just show you this metaphor, since I've got the slides come up, that Dante draws on. And this is obviously a modern picture, but Dante talks about how a beautiful mountain reflected in a perfectly still lake becomes one image in itself. It's an image of, again, this, rather than say enwombing, it's an image of mirroring. And I love this picture when I saw it, because you might say, you know, it's a picture of a mountain, and the glory of the mountain is echoed back in the reflection in the lake, and so amplifies the glory of the mountain. And that is certainly part of our relationship with the divine creator as creatures. In paradisal moments, we know that the mirror of our soul, as is sometimes said, can more and more clearly reflect the divine light. And so we know it in ourselves, and maybe even others see it reflecting from us as well. Certainly that's what would count if you were a saint. But Dante doesn't just stop it there. He says, well, actually, the mountain glories in the reflection too. It delights in what it sees as much as the reflection delights in its source. And so this two relationship becomes a whole new thing, that creator and creation become a third reality. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why Christianity is so drawn to the doctrine of the Trinity, because it's actually a lived experience of reality. And Blake captures that in this wonderful sketch of the Divine Trinity, which I don't know whether he was thinking of Dante's Divine Comedy when he did it, but I think it brings together the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso in the three persons of the Trinity. You might say that the figure of Christ there, shown with arms outstretched, is the suffering that Dante encountered in the Inferno, but it's embraced by the figure of the Father there in the middle, which is a bit like the embrace of suffering in Mount Purgatory, knowing that suffering isn't actually the end of the story, but actually is the portal to divine life. And then there's the embrace of the Spirit there above, which is the paradisal moment that can embrace everything and so lift everything into the divine life. Dante talks about this in other ways. He talks about how it's a bit like our experience of being a knower of something that we know, but awakening to the fact that there's a kind of knowing in that experience. A third appears, and that knowing is the spirit of what we can know and who we can be known by. Or another way that this manifests to us, I think, is when you think about love and how we as lovers love our beloved. But the wonderful thing about that is it awakens loving itself in that experience. And so the two-ness of being in love becomes a triangulated perception of all reality that's at once one in the loving that pervades all things. You know, or you might say that my being, even, dare I say, my being now, our beings all together in this evening, actually, when we tune in that little bit more, can be known as an experience of the being that's the source of all our seemingly separate beings as well. So a being encountering other beings is actually a revelation of being itself. One leading to two leading to three, leading back to the richness of the diverse harmony, dancing, spinning oneness. That's part of this vision. And here's, just to come to a close, John Flaxman's image of the final moments of the Divine Comedy, where Dante says that he knew that he was spinning like a perfect wheel with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And the tremendousness of this moment where he realizes that his being in the human form is somehow part and parcel of the divine light, the divine life. And it's only because he understands fully and completely how the way down is the way up, how the tragic is embraced by the comedic, by the divine life, and that his perception can expand even through the paradise to understand this process of divinization even more, that the Divine Comedy ends with its tremendous climax, that Dante knows himself to be spinning with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. You know, we're invited to know this, Dante says. He wrote the Divine Comedy not just as a personal meditation. He wrote it because he knows it to be true of life and invites us to know that as well. Amidst all the other things that I've tried to say, because of our engagement with the dualities of experience, seeing how they can be lent into, triangulated, and so precipitate us outside of ourselves, which was always the inside of ourselves, and know that as the ground of all being, the source and wellspring of all life. So if I stop sharing now, I hope that comes back just to me. We'll break out, I think, just for maybe 10 minutes or so, just to say hello to each other or have a stretch of the legs, get a drink. I thought that it would take a little longer this evening to go through some of that. You know, maybe just a final thought. You know, this is practical as well as visionary for us. It's about leaning into life, the difficult as well as the pleasurable, because that is a kind of perceptual key to divine wisdom. It's about learning to attend to the present moment, because that's the moment of return, rather than being preoccupied with the past and the future, and feeling in the tiniest moments almost, as well as in the great moments, how 2 leads to 3 leads to 1. If you can triangulate life, it doesn't just expand your perception, but that very perception is to enter Trinitarian life. In fact, is to know something more of the divine life and feel that it always was that which was giving you life. But look, if that's the sort of summary, let's now break out into these breakout rooms. Please do, you know, say what you made of all that, what did work, didn't work for you. Come back with questions, clarifications in about 10 minutes time. If you don't want to go out into the breakout rooms, then please don't do that. Just go and have a walk, get yourself a drink. We've been talking about the eternal waters, and sometimes it's quite good to have a glass of regular water when you're doing that. And we'll meet again at 1:30 where you are, for a final half hour. I hope, please, you know, teasing these things out, wondering and loving these things that little bit more. Thanks, James, if you want to initiate that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this beautiful talk, walking us through Dante's journey of the 3 realms. But yes, you should now receive the invitation, please do join, or just opt out when the invitation comes.
Great, well, thank you. It's always a bit hard to judge, what's a good length of time for a breakout discussion. So I feel slightly that might have been a bit short now, but anyway, the upside is that it gives us a full half hour to pick up questions. So as with last week, if you want to put questions in the chat or raise a hand, I must see that happening already, which is lovely. Oh, and by the way, just thank you to Michael for putting in the chat already that the figure who was holding his head as a lantern, guided only by his own sight, was Bertrand de Born, of course. So thank you for that. Okay, well, look, we've got a couple of hands already. Please, as I said before, the simplest questions are often the most powerful and illuminating. But anything that you would like to throw in or add, or and so on, something you've heard about Dante, do please seize this moment. Now is the moment for change. And but let's go to Abelardo for the first question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. That was for that wonderful, magical, sacred tour. I really got so much out of it. My question relates to what seems to be the universal experience for humans of what Dante portrays. For example, in the Buddhist cosmological view, there are three realms. What's called the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. All of these are within samsara. And beyond the samsara, there's ultimate reality, which is of the nature of clear light, that is also the essence of goodness, or the source of all goodness. Now, in the first of these realms, the desire realm, there are six, if you like, levels. There are three lower realms, which include hell, includes the realm of the hungry ghost beings, and there are the animals. Then there are the three higher realms. First, there's the level of the humans, where we're at, then demigods, and then gods. It's all about, all of this is part of the samsara, where we live, and its basic nature is of suffering. The personal journey is to understand what are the nature and causes of suffering, to know that there's a way out, a liberation, and what is the path, what needs to do, and to ultimately realize that all of this is of a relative nature, it's impermanent, and that the evolution is towards enlightenment. So the image of light, and that final image you showed of a mandala, it's also a symbol that's used all the time, but this is a pure mandala of white light that you express. So I see many analogies. I'd like to know your opinion on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are lots of parallels, because these are different traditions from maybe very different times and places, of course, nonetheless embracing reality at the deepest level. Maybe just make two or three comments. One is that three, you mentioned lots of threes there, and Dante's full of threes. The Divine Comedy is 100 cantos, but it's normally taken that the first canto is a sort of introductory canto when he wakes up midway through the course of our life. And then there's 33 cantos in the Inferno, 33 in the Purgatorio, and 33 in the Paradiso, making 100 in total. So a bunch of threes there. And then, Aristotle had noted that he thought three was the perfect number, not one, in fact. And he said that the point about three is that, three can embrace beginning, middle, and end, and hold it all together. if you're telling a story. If you have 3 legs on a tripod, it's much more stable than just 1 leg on a monopod. So he looked at all sorts of examples of why threeness should draw us and speak to us of reality in some way. But you mentioned also the mandala at the end there, and of course fullness has its own qualities that speak to us as well. I didn't really touch on that, but that can be found in the Divine Comedy too. Jung talks about the mandala being images of potentiality, of power, of realization, so there's something about that and how that relates to the one too, I'm sure. I mean, Dante, in terms of other traditions, Dante was definitely influenced by the Islamic tradition of otherworld journeys, in particular the Prophet's night journey. In Islam, there was already quite a tradition of breaking down perceptions of reality and realizing the different qualities that that affords, and so it enables you to embrace more and more of reality. And I've no doubt that he took much from the sense of the infernal regions and the paradisal regions. The purgatorial regions are fairly distinctly Western Christian, I think. But there's no doubt connections there. And then just the, yeah, that's right. The sense of there being a kind of reality outside of reality altogether. In the Divine Comedy, this is the Empyrean. So they go through the Inferno, up Mount Purgatory, through the heavens of the planetary spheres, into the sphere of the fixed stars, right onto the Prima Mobile, which is the meeting point of time and the timeless, of space and the spaceless, into the Empyrean, which is, I mean, if I say it's the domain most natural to the divine, it's only in the sense that it's the domain most natural to the fullness of the mystery of the divine. I think every domain is completely natural to the divine, which, that's the last thought in terms of linking it back to Buddhism is, I wouldn't claim to know a huge amount about Buddhist traditions, but I remember the phrase that samsara is nirvana, or nirvana is samsara, and the way that that's inflected in all sorts of different ways across different Buddhist traditions. That feels to me to be very much the vision that Dante's trying to convey as well. It's not about escape, it's actually about embrace. Yeah, so just some further thoughts there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. I agree with everything you say, but you talk about the historical differences, but my thesis is more that there are different expressions or insights into the human experience. That the universality might come from that level or source.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think that it's this thing about, how unity is not found by collapse into oneness. It's actually found by understanding the diversity more and more richly and fully. And that goes for us as individuals and for different traditions as well, I'm sure. And that, in the sphere of the sun, what seem like insurmountable differences are actually seen to be speaking even more of the embrace of reality, the richness, the infinite. The infinite can embrace all sorts of finitudes. It doesn't care at all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Richard, and thank you for waiting, and you've had your hand up as well.
Yes, my question has to do with the issue of suffering. And I was very much struck by your comment about suffering with hope, which goes along with this idea of holding the tension between opposites. My own personal experience in life, as well as with people that I know very well who have had profound numinous experiences, it always followed a period of almost existential suffering. And my question has to do with, as a Christian, and having read your book this last week, my question has to do with what Jesus said on the cross, the last thing well, before he said it is finished. My God, why have you forsaken me? And I would like to hear your comment on that in terms of suffering and the duality of that.
Yeah. I mean, I have wrestled with this comment because, for example, it seems to cut across the notion that the divine is all in all. How can it be, therefore, that Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I try to dodge and duck it a little bit by saying, well, look, he's just quoting Psalm 22. You know, he's a good Jew. That's the expression of his pain and lament and suffering in that moment. But that always felt a bit like a cop-out. Actually, I could refer to William Blake a little bit and also just sneak in an advert for who I'll be talking about next Sunday night, because actually Blake expresses it most clearly, although it's in Dante as well. When Blake says that eternal life embraces even what Blake calls eternal death. And I think that in that moment is actually the completion of Jesus's human experience by knowing the human experience of feeling completely cut off, the mortal experience of feeling the edges of mortality. But precisely because he has gone right through the middle of death, and knowing that, you know, not as it were being sneaky about it and saying, yeah, I'm going to die, but actually I know it's going to be all right on the other side. It's only by, we were saying this last week with Plato and the Phaedo, it's only by turning towards death, then turning towards death again, then turning towards death again, that every time we're met by life, but a richer and richer perception of life. And so Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think is the parallel to Virgil telling Dante, no, we don't turn around at the bottom of hell. We go right into the heart of the darkness and see what happens next by clambering on the body of Lucifer or Satan himself. So that's something of how I've understood it now, if that makes any sense to you.
Yes. Yes.
Great. Well, good. Thank you.
I also wonder if it's also that finally letting go of that human ego. You know, that final letting go, and then this profound numinous experience is, I don't want to say it's the result, but it probably has something to do with that duality that you have so focused on. And I thank you for that. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, this ego thing, because I think of it, the ego, I think, is a sort of false identity that can be quite useful for us. I wouldn't want to knock it completely myself. I mean, if I didn't have a bit of ego, I probably wouldn't be able to stand up and give a talk, for example. But I hope it's in the service of a wider truth that is all of our identities, put it like that. And so it's a constant process of one's own ego dying to the wider self, put it like that, rather than just sort of being wiped out once and for all. It's always, I think, again, another sort of nudge is always towards something that feels dynamic, not static. Then you know of wider life. Yeah, but you're getting that. That makes sense to you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. There's another question here, and I know I've noticed a couple in the chat, so I will go to those. But let's ask Niels to ask his question first. Thank you, Niels.
Yes. Hello, Mark. I don't know anything about Dante, but I do now. Thank you. So, but I'm a Christian for many years. In fact, God met me when I was 5 years old, and my father had committed suicide. I didn't know, no one told me. And I wonder what had happened to him. And I was walking down the street. In those days, there was plenty of room in the streets. So I just walked straight down, and I kind of, sometimes you talk like you talk to yourself. And suddenly the little voice said, it is all right, you'll be all right. And I felt a peace. And it wasn't until I was about 11 that someone I met in the street asked me if I knew that my father had committed suicide, and so I had the peace to accept that. So what is interesting is really that, to me, it is God who comes to you, but we can only, we are receptive, and that is, in fact, have you heard of A Course in Miracles?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, have you looked at it?
Yes, sure, I have the book.
Yeah, because
And
yes,
I've had conversations
I found
with people
that,
who followed it, yeah.
yes, I'm not necessarily a follower, but because I was doing something with computation, and someone suggested, have you read this book? And I said no, so I will have a look at it. Of course, as a religious Christian, some of it doesn't go down that well. Like Jesus, as allegedly, it is Jesus dictating this to two psychologists, and having a life experience as being a Christian who's also seen miracles and has had this close connection with the Holy Spirit, then it all makes sense. And but the most, yeah, that's not what I wanted to say. Yeah. And the question was really what happened to Jesus, that he said, why have you served me, or yeah. But Jesus also said just before he died, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. And to me, the whole story about Jesus is really that he didn't, I don't believe that it was God punishing him on behalf of our sins. He died simply because he was despised by the religious. It was religion that killed him. So that's it's difficult to see. He obviously, because God, he knew he had to go through this on his own without God's support. I mean, he could have called a legion of angels to come and set him free. He could just have disappeared out of it all, but he didn't.
Yeah, well, look, let me leap in there and just make a few comments. I'm slightly aware of the time, if that's all right.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the Divine Comedy, just to sort of pick up where you ended up there,
yes,
the significance of the cross is much discussed, in fact.
Yes.
And it changes as perception changes. That's broadly what happens.
Yes.
And until, but not by excluding older perceptions, but again, by embracing perceptions.
Yes.
And I think in the Christian tradition, this wisdom is remembered, because actually there's no settled view of the meaning of the cross in Christianity. No. You know, there's many so-called theories of the atonement. I think the one that shapes Dante's view most is what you might call what's sometimes called the exemplary vision, which is that Jesus is the way because he opens a way that then can become our way in, you know, the many different ways that we will follow it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that seems to me to be the one that Dante. But you know, I think that when we start talking about these things, and what I think is part of the brilliance of the Divine Comedy is that it takes evil and what goes wrong completely seriously. It's not just a kind of God coming in and wiping it away at all.
No, no.
So yeah, that's part of the brilliance of it, I think, as well, which is what resonates with what you're saying. Yeah. Neil, so I'm going to leap on to, because a couple more hands have come up now.
Yes,
so
it's fine. Thank you very much.
And so we've got time for others. Cheers. Thank you. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go to the chat and then I'll come to Kirby and Keith, who have got their hands up, because Gary has put a question in, I think. I'm just going to read it through and make sure it is a question. This is Gary Goldberg. There is the question of the meaning of time, dynamism, and action in the process of mediation, and the idea of intersubjective and relational time as the mediator, the loving that occurs between the lover and the beloved. What are we to understand about the nature of time from this recognition? Is time the primordial continuum, the origin? I think that, Plato did summarize it rather well, actually, that time is the moving image of eternity. So time is how we experience eternity, but in moments, rather than, say, subspecie eternitatis, from the perspective of eternity. But with Christianity and other theistic traditions, you could add a perception of Gregory of Nyssa, say. Gregory of Nyssa talks very beautifully about this, and he says how creation actually occurs in the divine life, in the divine mind, if you like, or in the Imperium, to use Dante's word. But we're having a temporal experience of that eternal creation in our most immediate temporal lives. And so we're having a sort of step-by-step experience of the tremendousness of the creative moment, the creative act, which is sort of complete already in divine life. And we will know that one day, even as we know our more immediate lives now. But it's about how, well, as again Blake put it, he said that time is the mercy of eternity. And I think he partly means by that, time has a limited duration when things are tough for us. So it's a mercy in that way. But it's also a mercy in the sense that time is the way through which we embrace and come to know and understand eternity as well, which is a great theme of the Divine Comedy. When the preoccupation with past and present particularly reduces enough to feel the moment, sorry, past and future, to feel the moment, and then that moment becomes the portal of eternity. So something like that's going on, if that makes any sense. Now let's ask Kirby to ask his question, and then we'll come to Keith. And then there's one more question actually in the chat from David as well. But maybe Kirby, can you go? You unmute and speak now. Thank you.
I'm glad to. Thank you very much, Mark. This has been an amazing experience for me. This question actually arose in our breakout group, and I want to give Valjean credit for being the originator of it. But what we were wondering is, how in heaven's name did Dante come up with this material, and how new was it? How much of a prophet is he? Was he well read in the writings of early Christian fathers and mothers? Could you please speak a little bit of the historical foundations of Dante's vision, if you will?
Yeah, and it's a great question, a very natural question, but that leads to more and more and more. So it's a great question. I mean, he was already a very well established, if not the leading poet of his city of Florence, before he came to turn to write the Divine Comedy. He was also a politician, and so his undoing really was because of his political activity. He was one of the 7 priors of Florence, and so was, well educated. He knew Thomas Aquinas. He knew other leading intellectuals of his day. So he had a huge amount to bring to bear to the writing of the Divine Comedy, and was already celebrated. But the difference is, you see, I think that he had a vision of some kind, we don't know what, he doesn't directly tell us, of divine life that was precipitated through the crisis of his life. And what actually happened in his historical life is in around 1301, he was exiled from Florence and couldn't return on pain of death. He would have been burnt at the stake if he had returned. And so spent the last 20 odd years of his life wandering around other parts of Italy, which, at the time were city-states, even speaking different languages. So, you know, for a poet, it was a serious business, and he lost contact with his family. He sometimes found hospitable places to stay, other times didn't. But it was that crisis that I think, coupled with some kind of tremendous sense of the divine presence and presumably visionary experience, that he was then able to knit into the Divine Comedy. And the significance of this is, again, that we're called to participate in divine life. We're not called just to sort of passively be blasted by it, although, you know, maybe on occasion that does happen. And so even Dante's own work, using his own genius and all that he had learned and practiced in himself, coupling that to the divine vision which he had, I think it's only when those two things come together that you get a work of true inspiration like the Divine Comedy. You know, and we know it's inspired because you keep returning to it and it keeps saying more, and this happens to countless people over 700 years and counting. So there was definitely the human side of Dante that's fully manifest in the Divine Comedy, but there's definitely the divine presence, in my view anyway, that is fully manifest in the Divine Comedy as well. So the very making of it is the bringing together of these two things, and you know, you feel that spirit as a result when you read it. Yeah, Keith, thank you.
Thanks, Mark, first of all, for the presentation. It's been very informative. You know, really appreciate that. And thanks to everyone else who is involved in putting, you know, the symposium together. My question has got to do with the numbers, the dualistic and the trinities that you mentioned. You know, I grew up as a Christian, so I'm very familiar with trinities. I studied Buddhism. I'm very familiar with dualities. And I'm Asian who was born, raised, and living in a Western culture. I'm wondering whether there is some sort of cultural or, you know, something about the Western versus Eastern cultures that, you know, points more towards trinities versus dualities. Any thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, you probably know better than me, but nonetheless, I think that you can detect similar dynamics. I think that Christianity has this particular challenge, stroke opportunity, because of the realization that Jesus was God incarnate in history, and with this particular stress that in this person's human individuality was the fullness of the oneness of God. And so it's wrestling with how to articulate that in particular the Trinitarian formula is come up. But, you know, Christianity is not the only tradition to talk about the divine dwelling in the human, of course, but it just does it in a particular way. And so you get parallels and echoes. And even, you know, in other traditions, I mean, just to give a nod to Taoism, you know, there it's, you get this sense of the one becoming two, becoming multiple, from the Tao that becomes, you know, the yin and the yang energies, and then that gives birth to the myriad things. And it's in Neoplatonism too. Yeah, so I think it's quite a common perception, you know, just even in thinking about numbers, of course, as well, and how oneness connects to two-ness, connects to three-ness, and so on. Yeah. Great. Hey, look, it's reached the hour. I'm just going to ask David's question because it's been in the chat, and then we'll draw to a close, if that's all right. So David asks, Mark, you said that the lesson of the comedy is that God doesn't want human puppets. God wants creatures to know of the creation, and certainly we humans can realize creation with a full self-consciousness. We don't just act out of instinct or desire and fear. We can act at least with our intellect fully engaged. But doesn't that go against the Bible story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Didn't they get tossed out from the garden for eating from the tree of knowledge? Well, I invite you as a little bit of homework, if you don't launch yourself into the Divine Comedy that you see this evening, to turn to the book of Genesis, because I think that whilst there's also the tree of knowledge in Eden, which they eat, there's also the tree of eternal life, and that something in that myth links the fall with the divine awareness for Adam and Eve, for all humanity. And so, you know, my thought is actually it's another version of this way down, way up link that is captured in the full story of the fall. Beatrice, just to refer to the Divine Comedy in a final thought, right in the highest heavens, Beatrice recounts the whole of human history through the Christian lens to Dante kind of one last time. And then she turns to him and says, do you know, Dante, it was all a bit of a digression. Here they are in the kind of divine light, and they're realizing that although the fall and return is absolutely necessary, it's also unnecessary. Just to throw one final duality at you now, you know, life is labyrinthine. There's this strange thing where we're free to make our own decisions, and yet ultimately at the same time we can't make wrong decisions. And in that paradox is, as you put there in your question there, David, our coming to full self-consciousness and realizing that that already was the eternal consciousness of God too. Experientially, it opens up. I'm getting some nods and smiles, so I'm thinking that it makes sense to people too. James, let me hand back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for that presentation and session. It's been really fantastic. It's been such great feedback in the chat. And also thank you for the topic, Dante. I mean, Dante is very important for Italy, as we've said, and we are, even though we are international, we are really Italian based. So of course, bringing it back to Dante, it's really important. So thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all so much for joining us. I'm gonna do some advertising for you, Mark. If you did enjoy this session, I'm just gonna put the link in the chat for your book on Dante, just if you're all interested. I also wanted to say, if you have enjoyed the series so far, I'd just like to invite you all to become a friend of the Pari Center, which is our membership program. By becoming a friend, you will receive a 10% discount on all of our events, both face-to-face and online. You get access to our members area of our website, which includes blogs, discussion groups, and also you will receive a subscription to our quarterly journal, the Pari Perspectives, which is edited and curated by Maureen Doolan. The Pari Perspectives is a journal full of essays and extracts of our series written by scholars and speakers at our events. I'm inviting you, especially now, because the next issue will come out next month in March with the theme of creativity. So I invite you all to at least have a look at the journal. Finally, I just hope to see you all next week for our third weekend, where on Saturday we will have Ruth Kastner and Gary Goldberg on connecting the actuality of things in space-time and the reality to the reality of possibility in quantum land. And then on Sunday we will have Mark again for his third Sunday on contraries and human existence, William Blake and cleansing the doors of perception. As always, you can contact us on our website, social media, or email at james@paricenter.com to contact me, or eleanor@paricenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you so much, Mark, for this session, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center. just going to close the call. Have a good evening, everyone.